Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second mini lecture of the week. In the first mini lecture, we discussed the stock market collapse that began, accompanied, and exacerbated the Great Depression, the most severe economic crisis in the 20th century, and the subject of this second mini lecture. In the third and final mini lecture of the week, we're going to look at the ecological disaster that really put these interlocked crises into full go mode, full steam ahead for economic devastation. This mini lecture is taking a look at some of the human experiences of the Depression, a brief look at Hoover's recovery plan, and an introduction to a documentary we'll watch over Thanksgiving break. But what was at stake during the Depression? A longer quote from the President of the United Mine Workers of America helps illustrate the gravity of the situation. According to John L. Lewis, quote, "The political stability of the Republic is imperiled. In excess of 12 million wage earners are unemployed. In certain industrial states, the percentage of unemployed equals 40% of the enrolled workers. Of the remaining 60%, a large number are employed on a part-time basis and are the victims of a continuous schedule of wage cutting. Those who are employed, directly or indirectly, must inevitably bear the burden of supporting the millions to whom employment is unavailable. The cost of maintenance of government and the support of non-productive institutions is, therefore, day by day being passed to the continuously decreasing number of citizens who are privileged to work. Our republic and our institutions cannot be expected to exist under the progressive accumulation of ills which results from our inability to properly organize our economic processes. Manifestation of widespread unrest and discouragement, almost akin to despair, are daily becoming more violent. Over wide areas, insurance companies and other investors find the population in rebellion against the usual processes of recovery from debt defaulters. Violent resistance to eviction for rent default daily becoming more evident. Disorder and rioting, because of the inadequacy of public relief, is increasingly prevalent. Continuing bank failures with their consequent train of human tragedies add to the sum total of bitterness of a population sick with waiting and deferred hope for intelligent economic and financial leadership. A student of history will find, in many a duplication of these appalling conditions, in the misery of the French people, antedating the French Revolution. The Bourbons of France, like some of the modern Bourbons in our own country, indulged themselves in idle chatter and continue to believe in their own security, notwithstanding the suffering and degradation of the masses. They paid for their error and their inaction with their heads. The appalling social and political problems arising from the present emergency are of a fundamentally economic concept. The restoration of order in our economic and industrial household is primarily essential to any intelligent disposition of the social and political problems of the nation. We are the victims of our own national short-sightedness by failure in the halcyon days of prosperity to intelligently plan for the future. A horde of small-time leaders in industry and finance, like the freebooters of old, vied with each other, looted the purse of the population, and diverted the proceeds to their own interests. Now that the day of adversity has come, these same leaders are destitute of competent suggestion to safeguard the present or the future, and they expect the population of this country to remain quiescent while they utter ponderous platitudes about balancing the budget and the necessity for further wage reductions. The very application of their wage-cutting fallacy further reduces the national income to a point where the population cannot sustain itself and the national budget cannot be balanced. The balancing of the budget will not in itself place a teaspoonful of milk in a hungry baby's stomach or remove the rags from its mother's back. John Lewis had a pretty good idea what was at stake during the Depression. But if you're ever wondering what else at stake during the Depression, let's take a look at how some other nations around the world fared. Germany turned towards Nazism, fascist authoritarianism, and militarism to rebuild its economy. And that really ended pretty badly. The Soviet Union, under the brutal dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, used a series of 5-year plans that involved forced labor and collectivization, and ended with a state-implemented and sanctioned starvation of millions of peasants. Japan was busy occupying China and Korea, manifesting a rather brutal form of empire, and stealing the wealth of their colonies and other nations to bolster their own economy. The United States was this close to losing its republican form of government, and nothing was ordained about the way it recovered. Political and economic instability are twin forces in society. They are often deeply interconnected, with one influencing the other. For many Americans, the question of the Depression was a question of survival. Not just losing a job or losing wealth from the stock downturn, but also a question of whether or not they would live through the crisis. It was just that serious. The NPR piece I selected in this week's content offers some memories from Depression survivors, and their stories are quite profound. In Montana, the Depression began in agriculture, and began with the overproduction crisis and the droughts which preceded the Dust Bowl. And here are some of their memories. Eric Olson of the Fort Peck area remembered the early 1930s. Quote, "Oh God, it was a terrible dry. Our first dry year was 1929, and it was real dry. Well, then we had 30, and that was another terrible dry year. 31 was another. 32 was a good year, but the price of wheat was, well, in Hinsdale it was 15 cents a bushel. And 33 was dry. 34 was terribly dry. 35 was dry. Oh boy, it was dry. 36 was real dry." James Womble of Jordan, quote, "I have only 6 workhorses left. Have 1,280 acres of land, but there is not enough grass on it for the 6 horses. I have nothing to live on. Have not made a good crop since 1928. Wallace Lockey later remembered, quote, "The 30s I don't want to remember at all. That was bad all the way through. Nobody had any money. You could buy a pair of overalls for 25 cents, but no one had 25 cents. Writing to Montana's governor after losing her savings at a bank failure, Mrs. H. Frederickson said, quote, "So no money to pay taxes and interests, and we have never wasted a cent for shows and dances and so on. I cannot get a job and work, for there is no work to be gotten here, and I don't like to separate my family. Can you advise me as to what to do, as we have always paid our honest debts when we could raise the money to do so? It was never spent for finery, for I am not too nice to wear a cast-off shirt and overalls of my husband to work in the field. If only we could raise a crop again, we could live." John Haig, a grocer from Sanders County, who had extended thousands of dollars of credit to his neighbors and was now facing his own economic ruin, wrote, quote, "Work is what they want, not dole. The world owes no man a living, but it certainly owes all of its people a chance to make a living." The people that lived through the Depression lived through an economic hell. Agricultural crises, lost savings, high unemployment, low pay, and other factors all combined to make people's lives tenuous and miserable, and their survival questionable. As president, Herbert Hoover stared into the abyss of the worst financial and economic crisis that the U.S. had experienced. It certainly defined his presidency, and likely came to define his life in popular memory. Hoover knew that economic downturns had a profound effect, as he had sought employment during the downturn after the Panic of 1893 and witnessed another downturn in Australia in 1901 to 1903. However, the famous presidential historian Richard Hofstadter called Hoover a, quote, "wide-eyed utopian capitalist." Well before the onset of the Depression, Hoover's inaugural address buoyed with positivity. Quote, "Ours is a land rich in resources, stimulating in its glorious beauty, filled with millions of happy homes, blessed with comfort and opportunity. In no nation are the institutions of progress more advanced. In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. In no nation is the government more worthy of respect. No country is more loved by its people. I have an abiding faith in their capacity, integrity, and high purpose. I have no fear for the future of our country. It is bright with hope." Those are proud words in an inaugural address, and Hoover would see the grit and character of the American people shortly. As we've seen over the past few lectures on Hoover, he was no stranger to emergency. He was likely the most qualified and competent disaster manager in the United States, having evacuated over 120,000 Americans from Europe, having fed millions of Europe's civilians in the midst of the Great War and preventing a famine, having fed an additional 20 million civilians in Eastern Europe during the Soviet-Polish War and the Russian Revolution, preventing another famine. He had led the U.S. government's response to the catastrophic 1927 Mississippi River floods, where millions of Americans had become environmental refugees. Perhaps the most critical part of these massive disaster responses was that Hoover evacuated, fed, housed, and saved millions of people through private donations and fundraising, including donations from his personal fortune. Hoover believed in resilience and hard work as an American ethos. To get through the crisis, Hoover preached volunteerism and private charity, especially from the highest levels of industry. Factories should remain open as long as possible and to pay as many of their workers as much as they could. Wealthy capitalists should donate funds to the relief efforts. Banks should lend. People should work hard, all on a voluntary basis to help their neighbors and countrymen. Hoover resisted offering direct government aid to the unemployed, both for philosophical reasons, but also because he wanted to keep the government's resources in reserve. Much like the unprecedented carnage of the Great War, the unprecedented suffering of the Great Depression shattered illusions and any remaining ideas of normalcy. By 1931, the economic situation was so desperate that private charity, a key pillar in Hoover's recovery strategy, was depleted. Large-scale foreclosures on mortgages created another internal refugee crisis, as millions of newly homeless people migrated for employment. An environmental disaster, the Dust Bowl, displaced even more and jeopardized U.S. foodstuff production as the topsoils of the Great Plains were blown into the air and out to the Atlantic Ocean. Hoover's early government interventions in the economic crisis were targeted. Through the Federal Farm Board, Hoover extended loans and credit to farmers and set up several purchasing boards to stir demands for agricultural products, especially wool. Hoover also used public work projects as a means of economic recovery, pushing for a major electrification project in the Tennessee Valley. And he signed the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff to help protect domestic industry. Unfortunately, many economists argue that this tariff worsened the economic situation. It also makes a cameo in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Hoover also implemented the Mexican repatriation program, which we are going to read about in Decade of Betrayal. I'm going to let Balderrama and Rodriguez give that history. But the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Mexicans and Mexican Americans meets the definition of ethnic cleansing and was a profound violation of human rights. By 1932, many of these policies were starting to work, but they were largely ineffective at tackling the massive economic crisis. Ideas about physics and inertia can be helpful for describing the scope of the crisis. An object, in this case the American economy, tends to stay in motion, in this case downward, unless acted on by an outside force. If the American economy during the Great Depression was a gigantic ball of burning dumpster fires rolling downhill, then many of Hoover's early policies were like shooting spitballs and water guns at it and hoping it would stop. Most of the policies were directed at encouraging enterprise and capitalism, aiming to create employment rather than to alleviate the profound misery of the populace. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, for example, offered loans to businesses, local governments, railroads, and other groups to aid and support their relief efforts, and it was later rolled into a New Deal program under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. Hoover also pushed for the passage of the 1932 Glass-Steagall Act, which dramatically reformed the U.S. banking system. By the time that Hoover left office after his single term and handed over the recovery efforts to FDR's team, they found that Hoover had taken great steps to reform the top of the economy, reshaping banking and credit, but he had not done nearly enough to ameliorate the condition of most Americans. Desperation. Among the greatest political threats that faced Hoover were a large group of World War I veterans desperate for relief. A decade before, these doughboys fought in the fields of France, facing the horrors of industrial war. In 1924, when the economy was booming, Congress authorized the payment of a bonus for the veterans to be paid out in 1945. Its original intent was as a pension program to help out the World War I vets in their retirement, and it was going to take effect roughly 25 years after the armistice. However, as we'll see in one of the documentaries for next week, the Great Depression profoundly affected these veterans along with the rest of the population. They were desperate and needed relief, something, anything. Many of the veterans embarked on an audacious march across the country to Washington, D.C., requesting their bonuses early, as they feared they would not live through the Depression to collect them in old age. Think about that for a second. These men had seen trench warfare in Europe, and yet they feared that they would literally starve to death without aid in their own countries. That's how close it came. The U.S. Congress and Hoover refused to authorize early payment of the pensions, and Hoover sent in the Army to remove the bonus army from D.C. Troops under the command of Douglas MacArthur, assisted by George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower, moved on the World War I veterans and attempted to destroy their encampment. Tents and shanties were burned. Tanks rolled through D.C., with their cannons aimed at veterans and their families. Again, this is active duty members of the United States Army, pointing lethal weaponry at veterans of World War I, who had seen that and felt it and experienced every horror of it. I'm going to let the documentary take over their story, but Hoover's use of the Army to suppress the protest of the bonus army was another factor in his devastating electoral defeat in 1932. We're going to pick up on the recovery from the Depression after Thanksgiving week, so I'll conclude this mini lecture here.